Bill Callahan is here to shake up the Falcons' offensive line and deliver a legit top 5 unit.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And today's Locked On Falcons podcast is presented by Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. We're now in year 10 as a humble host of this daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And today we are continuing our positional reviews. We're taking a deep dive into the offensive line, talking about some of the changes and the optimism that should come with the hiring of Bill Callahan as the Falcons' new offensive line coach, where things weren't quite living up to expectations with the former offensive line coach, Dwayne Ledford. We'll talk about whether or not we'll see some real investments in this offensive line in the near future, talk about some of the offensive line issues that led to Kevin Stefanski's downfall in Cleveland, and if the Falcons can avoid those issues, as well as talk about some of the Falcons' short yardage struggles, which kind of embody the concerns with this offensive line. But as I mentioned, the Falcons are hiring Bill Callahan as their new offensive line coach. They made that official, I believe, on Tuesday. He will be replacing Dwayne Ledford, who has served in that role since the 2021 season. And to me, this can be summarized as good news. There's the potential for far less complacency with the Falcons' offensive line with this single move. And I say that not because Dwayne Ledford's a bad coach. I think he's a very good coach. I think given the circumstances that he was asked to work under, I think he did excellent work here in Atlanta over the last 5 years. But those circumstances I felt like were mostly about maintaining, particularly over the last 3 years, maintaining the Falcons' offensive line. You heard me at the end of yesterday's episode talk about how people are more invested in maintaining the 8-9 Falcons roster versus building a 12-5 Falcons roster. And I feel like the offensive line kind of perfectly embodies that. The offensive line, I think, is kind of a microcosm of all my issues with the Falcons and when it comes to complacency, where it's like, yeah, this is a good enough offensive line, right? You know, they're probably in the top 14, good enough to make the playoffs, similar how the Falcons are a good enough team to make the playoffs, primarily because they play in the worst division in football. If you put them in any other division, you wouldn't necessarily think of them as a playoff team. But, again, you can only control what you can control. And it's like the offensive line to me is like the Falcons haven't been interested in improving that, good enough team. It's just like, it's good enough. We're good. And it's the same thing with the team overall, where it just feels like, oh, we're good enough to win the NFC South. So why try even harder to be better, to be a team that could, in theory, win the NFC East or win the AFC, South or something like that. But, I say the Falcons have been sort of trying to maintain it since 2023, because when you look at the 9 offensive linemen that played for most of this season on the Falcons roster, only really 2 of those guys have been added since 2023. Right, you brought in guys like Javon Gwynn and Matthew Bergeron, as well as I believe Kyle Hinton in that 2023 year offseason. Technically, Elijah Wilkinson was added since then, but Elijah Wilkinson was on the team in 22, left the team in 23, and then came back in 24. So it's like, he didn't really change. So the only new faces you have on your offensive line room over the last 3 years has basically been Jack Nelson, who you drafted in the 7th round this year, and Michael Jarrell, who you only traded for because Kaleb McGary got injured. So that kind of indicates what I'm talking about, where it's like the Falcons haven't been really trying to build their offensive line. It's just been trying to maintain the continuity that they started establishing a couple of years ago. And, I feel like this offensive line under Dwayne Ledford kind of peaked in 2022, and it's been trending down ever since. We'll explain some of that when we talk about their short yardage struggles a little bit later in the episode. And I feel like if we're using an analogy of like trying to, land the plane, right? Like the engine stalled out, and Dwayne Ledford is a good coach. What I mean when I say he's like the circumstances, he's going to level this thing out, and he's going to put this plane on the ground. He's going to save everybody. He's a great pilot, and he can level this thing out. But the plane is going down. Is basically what I'm trying to put out. And Dwayne Ledford's job has basically been to kind of level it out and make that as smooth a landing as you can possibly make it. And that's been the direction that the Falcons have been trending since 2022. And the hope is with adding Bill Callahan is he's going to pull them out of that dive and get them back, figure out the way to fix the engine again. Analogy doesn't really work that way, but you know what I'm saying? Like get it so that the engine cuts back on and get this team back up to, 30,000 feet or whatever it is that they need to be to maintain cruising weight. Again, the plane analogies, again, I'm making up on the fly. But, I'm optimistic that Callahan is going to be able to do that because pretty much everywhere he's gone, he's built one of the best offensive lines in football. And that's been the case for 25 plus years, right? That when we talk about the best offensive line coaches in the NFL over the last 20-ish years, I think Dante Scarnecchia, the former Patriots O-line coach, as well as Jeff Stoutland, the current Eagles offensive line coach, are kind of the gold standard. I'd probably put Callahan more as the silver right behind those guys, just because I think those guys have slightly more examples of them being able to, take a day 3 talent, Jordan Mailata in Philadelphia, Joe Thuney in New England, and turn that guy into a perennial all-pro. Callahan has a few examples. Wyatt Teller's a pretty good example of that, but it just felt like those guys have a few more examples, and that's why they're the gold standard and Callahan's the silver standard. I think Dwayne Ledford is probably the bronze standard when it comes to offensive line coaches. But when you go back to Callahan's record, going back to the late 90s when he was the O-line coach under John Gruden before he became the head coach of the Raiders to replace John Gruden, right? Those Raiders offensive lines had some of the best offensive lines in football. After he got fired in Oakland, he went to become the head coach at Nebraska for a couple of years. He was able to produce NFL caliber guards and Richie Incognito, Carl Nix, Matt Slauson. Those 3 guys combined for 350 plus career starts in the NFL. So able to turn that talent into that. He gets back into the NFL. He's coaching the offensive line with the Jets under Rex Ryan, right? And pretty much every year up until this last few years with Tennessee, pretty consistently was able to produce either a top 5, if not a number 1 offensive line, starting with the Jets team anchored by guys like Nick Mangold and DeBrickashaw Ferguson. He moved on to Dallas, and where he was coaching the Tyron Smith, Zach Martin, Travis Frederick offensive lines in their early heyday. Goes to Washington, right, under Jay Gruden. Was it Jason Garrett in Dallas? Trent Williams, Brandon Scherf, Morgan Moses are there in Washington. He moves on to Cleveland with Kevin Stefanski. He gets Joe Batonio, Wyatt Teller, J.C. Treader, Jack Conklin, all those guys. And then he's with his son, Brian, the last 2 years in Tennessee. They didn't live up to the hype in terms of like instant turnaround, but there was improvement over those 2 years, right? Skoronski got better. Latham got better, right? According to PFF, they had the Titans offensive line rated as the worst offensive line in football at the end of the 2023 season. At the end of the 2025 season, hey, they were 23. Hey, that's an improvement where they were from where, So he was able to get more out of that unit and probably could have continued to coach up that unit had he got more time. And so hopefully the Falcons can get to a point where rather than being a quote unquote top 14 unit, they can be a top 4 unit, right? Which is what Callahan is considered, where it's like even the hater himself, it can't deny that this is one of the best offensive lines in football. And I think in order to get there, this team is going to have to invest the resources to get there rather than doing what they have done by and large for the last 3 years, which is trying to just maintain it, right? And they haven't really had interested in building this offensive line. It's just like, oh, well, our continuity will take care of itself and Ledford will do a great job. And it's like, that's not the worst decision in the history of the world, but it is one of those decisions that to me is in the embodiment of the complacency that has been pervasive of the Falcons over the last 8 years, where they've had 8 losing records. And they're like, this is pretty good. This works for me. And they don't try hard enough. But again, that's the hill I will continue to die on here on this podcast. So the hope is that Callahan's going to shake it up, but it's not just about Bill Callahan and what he's going to bring to the table. We'll talk about the diversifying of the run game and all those various things later in the episode, but it's also hopefully Kevin Stefanski looks at his own failures in Cleveland and is wanting to shake up this offensive line, because I think the stagnation of his O-line in Cleveland contributed to that offense's downfall over the last couple of seasons. And hopefully, he will want to avoid that in Atlanta by shaking things up And we'll break that down as well as talk about the team's short yardage struggles, which is going to explain why I am not as high on the Falcons offensive line as maybe other people are as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So what if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house. It's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action. So when momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood, now available across the US. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and clear swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives, LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. Today's episode is also brought to you by Game Time. We know that there's nothing like being at the game, whether we're talking about playoff football, basketball, baseball, etc. The crowd noise, the energy, the cheering alongside the other fans, being at the stadium just hits different. But the frustrating part is trying to get tickets to get in the stadium. Got to worry about queues, logins, and watching prices change at checkout. And Game Time is the app that's going to take the advantage and give it back to the fans and take the guesswork out of getting tickets to whatever your favorite events, whether it's sports, concerts, music, theater, comedy, whatever is near you, right? We love Game Time here on Locked On because what you see is what you get, right? The price you see is the price you pay. No hidden fees at checkout. You also can preview your view from your seat with panoramic seat views, so there are no surprises when you show up. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON NFL. That's Locked On NFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code Locked On NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today and get back to being there live. Before we continue today's episode, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And if you want to level up your everydayerness, you can do so by becoming a member of the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below for $5 a month or $50 a year at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. You can become an Everydayer Club member, get an ad-free version of the Locked On Falcons podcast, Discord access, so you can talk trash, right? I'm in there fighting for my life against some Saints fans. So please come and join me, right? And you also get some sweet Locked On merch, right? There you go. Don't mind the stains. I've already ruined it right now, but don't ruin yours by going to that link in the description below for $5 a month or $50 a year. So go check it out. So I talked about Kevin Stefanski's downfall was contributed, I think, to some stagnation on the offensive line. The Browns this past year had the oldest offensive line in football this past season. The Falcons, by the way, had the 5th oldest line in football this season. And, the reason why that matters is because as guys get older, injuries become a little bit more impactful because they struggle to sort of fight through those injuries. As we saw, Julio Jones is a great example for Falcon fans, that he was able to gut through injuries for a number of years and then hit a certain age and couldn't gut through those injuries anymore. And it ended his career. The Browns have dealt with injuries on their offensive line throughout Kevin Stefanski's tenure, but the last 2 seasons in particular, as their offensive line got older and older, it really struggled to maintain continuity early in seasons, right? In both of the last 2 seasons, they were constantly swapping out who the 5 starters were in the first half of the season, right? In 2025, they had 7 different 5-man combos of starting offensive lines in their first 7 games this past season. And then the previous year, it was 7 different units in the first 8 games. And that really limits your ability to build continuity over the course of the first half of the season when your offense is trying to work out all those kinks and you're constantly dealing with swapping, offensive linemen in and out of the lineup. And so hopefully that experience for Kevin Stefanski will allow him to not trust in an aging offensive line, which the Falcons have, right? As I said, they were the 5th oldest offensive line in football this past year. Their average age is in 2026 is going to basically be the same average age as the Browns offensive line was in 2024. And then by 2027, they'll be the same 30-plus-year-old on average offensive line that the Browns were this past season. And so there's kind of always been this ticking clock for the Falcons offensive line this entire time. And their success and failure, I think, for this upcoming regime, some of that, not all of it, but some of it hinges on their ability to kind of rebuild and revamp this offensive line and get younger in the next 2 to 3 years to avoid this sort of ticking clock that happened with the Browns. And, we saw an older offensive line also doom the Dan Quinn regime, right? Where early on in that regime, they were trusting in veterans like Andy Levitre, Alex Mack, Chris Chester, and those guys started to age out, Ryan Schrader as well. And that offensive line fell off a cliff in 2018. And it really took until Ledford's arrival in 2021 and then, solving those issues in 2022 before the offensive line stopped being a major, major issue and anchor point for this team. And, that also contributed to the president of football in all of Turkmenistan, Matt Ryan's downfall here in Atlanta, where he had to finish his career playing behind a bad offensive line. And that that prevented the Falcons from, Matt Ryan from finishing his career strong here in Atlanta. And you don't want to put the next quarterback, whether that's Michael Penix, whether that's somebody else, in that predicament where from 2027 for the next 3 years, it takes the Falcons 3 years to kind of build out of that. And their offense can't really overcome that, like we saw at the end of Matt Ryan's career. And, and imagine that for a young quarterback like Michael Penix or a rookie quarterback coming up. Matt Ryan was a decade-plus veteran at that point. And so he could navigate that. It's going to be a lot harder for a rookie quarterback to do. So, I always say you reap what you sow. That's true on the offensive line. The Browns did not invest enough resources on their offensive line over the course of Stefanski's time there. Eventually that caught up to him. My worry with the Falcons, because they haven't invested a lot of resources in their offensive line since 2023, that's also on the verge of catching up to them. And hopefully this regime change will shift that moving forward. But we'll talk about that a little bit later, whether or not we're going to see those investments this offseason as opposed to waiting again. But talked about the short yardage things, right? And I don't want to sit here and act like short yardage is the end all be all of determining whether an offensive line is good. But oftentimes, when you need a yard, you want your offensive line to go out there and get you a yard. And this is an area where the Falcons offensive line has consistently struggled in the Ledford era and in previous years, right? And when we're talking about short yardage success, we're talking about what the first down conversion rate is on any down where there's only 1 or 2 yards to gain to either score or get a first down. Now, the last time the Falcons were in the playoffs in short yardage success, they were ranked 17th in 2017 and 14th in 2016. In the 8 years since, they have finished 17th or higher only twice. In 2019, they finished 7th. In 2024, they finished 16th. Now, we discussed last year that dichotomy with the 2024 team, where when Dahlman was in the lineup last year, the Falcons were a top 3 short yardage team. And when Newsel was in the lineup, they were bottom 3 short yardage team, right? Now, this past year, they were able to improve that number. Even without Kaleb McGary, they were 24th in short yardage success. But here's the thing that's notable. These 8 years that they have been out of the playoffs, including this past season, 6 out of those 8 years, the Falcons have not finished better than 22nd in short yardage. And 2 of those years, they finished 32nd. That was 2020 and 2021. And in 2023, they were 31st in short yardage success rate. And so Ledford inherited the worst short yardage team in the NFL in 2020 and 2021. And collectively, if you look at the 5 seasons that Ledford has coached his team, so 2021 through 2025, all 5 of these seasons, collectively, the Falcons have been 31st in short yardage success rate combined over the last 5 years. They are slightly ahead of only the Miami Dolphins, who, by the way, pushed around the Falcons in short yardage this past season. Just want to make that note. Anytime I get too high on the Falcons, I remember that Dolphins game, and I'm like, oh, yeah, they're not that good. But, this to me is one of the reasons why I don't give the Falcons offensive line as much love as others do. Right? Every day I go on the internet and someone's like, oh, this is one of the best offensive lines of football. It's like, is it though? Let's say it is. Let's say it is one of the best offensive lines of football, except when it's 3rd and 1 or 2nd and 2. Because in those situations, it's basically the worst offensive line of football, is basically what I'm sitting here saying. And basically my cognitive dissonance can't reconcile those two opposing points, where it's like, oh, this is a really good offensive line, but it's also the worst offensive line in critical situations where you need to get a yard. It's literally the worst offensive, or the second worst offensive line in those critical situations. And so my hope is that Bill Callahan's going to help improve this, right? In that 2020 season, the Falcons were 32nd in short yardage success. The Browns, and that was the first year of Stefanski and Callahan in Cleveland, they were 31st. They improved to 4th in 2021. So you can see that sort of turnaround. And you look at the collective times when he was in Tennessee, 10th in short yardage, Cleveland, 17th, Washington, 15th, Dallas, 2nd, Jets, 3rd. So pretty consistently an average to above average short yardage team across Bill Callahan's tenure, right? Over the last decade, that's been more in that 10 to 15 range. But, in the previous decade, it was pretty much top 3. So hopefully we'll see that return to Atlanta, right? And I think part of the reason why the Falcons struggle with short yardage is because they have run an egregious amount of outside zone over the last 5 years, right? And I think that contributes it, right? Outside zone is much more of an east-west run scheme rather than a north-south run scheme, and that's not as conducive to getting 1 yard when you need it, right? And one of the things we expect to see from Stefanski and Callahan is a shift away from the outside zone into a much more diverse run scheme. I still think outside zone is going to be a staple of this offense, as it was at various times in Cleveland under Stefanski. But the Browns ran outside zone a quote-unquote normal amount, throughout those years, right? You look at Callahan's last 2 years in Cleveland, where we have data from FT and Fantasy. The Browns ran outside zone 25% of the time. Over that period of time, the NFL average was about 17% of the time. Meanwhile, in those 2 years alone, the Falcons ran outside zone 47% of the time. And so it basically breaks down that on an average NFL game, teams run the ball about 27 times. We'll say 25 just to make it more even. The Falcons would run outside zone about 12 times. The Browns would run it about 6 times, and the average NFL team will run it 4 times. And so you're going to see that number reduce. Now, I would imagine that the Falcons this year would still probably run it 6, 8, possibly more times. But I think that's a normal, healthy amount of outside zone rather than just kind of spamming one pitch. We've talked so many times over the last calendar year that you want to have multiple pitches, right? Because if you just have one good pitch and you're facing a team that knows how to hit that pitch, right? Sean McVay, this is a big reason why Sean McVay moved past outside zone, started moving past it 5 to 7 years ago, because Vic Fangio basically was like, oh, we can hit your pitch on the outside zone. And he was like, you're not going to get me again. Right. And so they've moved away from it. But it's like, you want to have multiple good pitches because you're going to face opponents, over the course of an NFL season that are going to be able to hit your best pitch, and you need to be able to pivot. And the better teams can do, I say this all the time in football, doing 2 things well is better than doing 1 thing well. That will always be true. I've yet to find an exception in 35 years of watching football, right? Being good at 2 things is always better than being good at 1. But, I think if the Falcons are going to get there, they're going to have to make some changes on their offensive line. But I think that's going to be a challenge to do that immediately in 2026. And that may be something that the Falcons will have to punt on until 2027. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the Falcons' history of coaching hires hasn't always been so illustrious, right? They often find someone that looks good on paper and then find out later that that person isn't the right fit. Now, hopefully, things are going differently with Kevin Stefanski. But, it would be a lot easier for the Falcons and other NFL teams if they had Indeed-sponsored jobs on the case to help them find the right match. Now, if you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. You can stop struggling to get your job post seen on other websites. Indeed-sponsored jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you search for the right candidates even faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a higher than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results by using Indeed sponsored jobs. And you'll get a $75 sponsored job credit to help you give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. Now, wouldn't it be nice when you're doing your taxes that it was just as easy as it looks when Bijan Robinson is running the football? And now it can. With TurboTax Full Service, you can hand off your taxes to a local expert and not have to stress from start to finish. It's like handing off the ball to Bijan Robinson and just stand back, let him cook, right? Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything, all your forms, W-2, self-employment, and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver. It's going to give you real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it, just like the peace of mind you get when you watch Bijan Robinson play football. So for a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. So, I don't expect the Falcons to make any major changes to their starting lineup on the offensive line in 2026. I think Terry Fontenot's parting, air quotes, gift, depending on what your perspective is, was basically setting it up so the Falcons, I won't say forced, but are compelled. Same word, right? Fancier way of saying it. To bring back the same 5 starters in 2026, right? Jake Matthews and Kaleb McGary have their guarantees through 2026. Chris Lindstrom's no longer has guarantees on this contract, but basically his bonus makes it so that he's pretty much locked in through this season, but not after this season, 2026 that is. And both Ryan Nuzzo and Matthew Bergeron are free agents after this upcoming season. You also have most of your depth back under contract in 2026, right? Storm Norton, Mike Jarrell, Kyle Hinton, Javon Gwynn, Jack Nelson are all under contract this year. Elijah Wilkins is really the only guy that's a free agent. So I'm expecting Callahan to kind of come in. He's going to sing the praises of us. He's like, oh, I love this offensive line. It's great. It's wonderful. And I think they're just going to use 2026 as an evaluation year. That's my guess, right? Maybe they shake up the depth a little bit, but I would be surprised if they made any major additions. I would love to see them use one of their early round picks on an offensive lineman. But as we sit here today in January, I'm not necessarily expecting that, but we got 3 months, to figure that all out. So, I think if the Falcons were to try to make an immediate upgrade on any of these 5 starting spots, center would probably be the position. That would be the position I think right now, as we sit here from a depth standpoint, is the most vulnerable spot. At least they have bodies at the other positions that are functional bodies, as we saw with Kyle Hinton, where there was little to no drop-off from Bergeron to Hinton last year, and we've seen in the past where there hasn't been a massive drop-off when Storm Norton has gotten in the lineup either. And, of course, we all know that Jack Nelson is a superstar in the making for this Falcons offensive line. So, I'm very critical of Nuzzo on this podcast a bunch. I actually like Brian Nuzzo, but he kind of perfectly embodies all the sort of complacency I hate, and so I kind of take it out on him from time to time where it's like, I think he's good enough to start, but I don't think he's necessarily a good starter. Now, PFF grades, and I think he got like 1 or 2 All-Pro votes this year. So clearly there's at least 1 or 2 voters out there that, quote unquote, no ball that know more than I do when it comes to that. But, Bergeron's been another player that I've been very critical of over the years. I'm going to back off of that criticism in 2026 compared to previous years. I think he has made improvements the last 3 years. I think, from year 1 to year 2 was the pass protection. I think from year 2 to this past year 3, it was the run blocking, right? And I've had high standards for Bergeron. I don't think they've been unreasonably high standards, but he hasn't quite lived up to them. And basically I'm just like, okay, he'll do what he's going to do, right? And that probably because I'm not going to put the expectations on him. He's going to make probably the biggest leap he's made in his career and be really good in year 4. Hopefully that will be the case. But I sit here with him coming up on a contract that if the decision was made today, and obviously it's not being made today, the standard going rate for a quality starting guard in free agency is like $14 to $20 million a year. I don't think Bergeron has lived up to that, but a year from now, we could be having a very different conversation. So hopefully we will get there with Matthew Bergeron. So if you're tired of the anti-Canadian slander on this podcast, we will have far less of it in 2026 in all likelihood. Again, I won't make any promises, but that's my goal. With Matthews and McGary, I mentioned before last week or a week or 2 ago that Jake Matthews is like 34 starts away from tying his dad's consecutive start record. And so I'm assuming that Jake is going to try to play that long, but we'll see if he does. We'll see if he's healthy. We'll see if he plays well. I think it totally makes sense for the Falcons to draft insurance, in the event that something goes wrong with that plan. I'm not currently expecting McGary to be on the team past 2026. Like, I think this is going to be the last year of him. He is signed technically through the 2027 season, so it's definitely possible. I think a lot of it's going to just depend on how good he looks coming off this knee injury in 2026, whether or not he's going to be back in 2027. Lindstrom is probably the only other guy besides Jake Matthews that I would be reasonably confident betting is going to still be on the team in 2 to 3 years from now. But 2 to 3 years from now, with Lindstrom getting up there in age, being on the wrong side of 30 at that point, we might be having a conversation 2 to 3 years from now about drafting his replacement, like we're having a conversation now about potentially drafting Jake Matthews' replacement, right? We could be talking about a 2028 third-round guard and like, yeah, this guy's kind of the perfect Lindstrom replacement, right? Isn't it? So ultimately, we'll see how it shakes out. I think there's going to be a bunch of older free agents that have played under Callahan that are hitting the market. So if the Falcons are willing to pay for it, they could go out there and get a stopgap starter or two if they are looking to kind of shake things up in the starting lineup immediately. Some of these guys could be brought on as backups potentially. We'll see what the market kind of dictates out there. So there are going to be opportunities, I think, for the Falcons if they do want to start investing in the offensive line in 2026. But I think similar to what we saw back in 2024, when Raheem came in and was basically like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, when it came to retaining the running backs coach and retaining the offensive line coach and thinking this run game was going to easily bounce back after a down 2023 season, and he was right. I could see the Falcons having a similar approach and basically be like, we'll just punt this decision to next offseason because we don't have the draft capital. We don't have the cap space. We got other issues that we want to deal with. So we'll see how the Falcons approach it. We'll see how it all shakes out. But that's going to do it for us here today, guys, on this offensive line review. We have one more review coming your way, which will probably come Friday night on YouTube, Saturday on your audio feeds. That will be an in-depth breakdown of Michael Penix. But tomorrow's episode, between now and then, we'll get Jarvis Davis on the pod, hopefully, and talk about all the stuff going on with Stefanski being a bad cultural fit. We'll get Jarvis's thoughts on that. We'll talk about the GM search. We'll talk about the Tommy Rees hire, and maybe Jarvis and I will get into some Senior Bowl talk since both of us are planning on being in Mobile next week. So, you'll see me from an undisclosed location in Mobile, Alabama. Hopefully, again, we got to get through this winter storm. We'll see. Hopefully, I'll make it down to Mobile in one piece. So we'll see on that front. So that's what's in store for you on tomorrow's Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL for your second listen to get the scoop on all the big stories going on with the other 31 NFL teams. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. For $5 a month, $50 a year, you can get some sweet Locked On merch. Help me fight the good fight in the Discord server. Get some, plucky Saints fans. And of course, you get an audio version ad-free of Locked On Falcons. So go check it out in the link in the description below. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.